Thanks, President. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs about Tibet. Minister, decisions regarding the selection, education and veneration of Tibetan Buddhist religious leaders are exclusively spiritual matters that should be made by the appropriate religious authorities within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and in the context of the will of practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism. So, Foreign Minister, in your conversations with representatives of the Chinese government, what are you doing to ensure that these practices are protected in Tibet and to ensure that the Chinese government does not have a role in the selection of the next Dalai Lama?
Thank you to Senator Rice for her question, and I also acknowledge that she is one of the co-chairs of the Parliamentary Friends Group, as is my colleague Ms Templeman, and I think Senator Smith, and to thank you for your work in that context. As I said to representatives of the Tibetan community with whom I met today, and I've met with a number of them previously, it's a very important part of engagement to have parliamentary groups who are obviously able to engage as parliamentarians with members of the community and to, as parliamentarians, make statements, and I understand that statements were made, although I wasn't obviously present, at your media conference. It is the case that we are concerned about the erosion of rights and freedoms in Tibet, and we, in our engagement with our counterparts at a number of levels, continue to raise concerns with the representatives of the Chinese government about the erosion of rights and freedoms in Tibet. We are gravely concerned by disturbing reports of the separation of Tibetan children from their families, about the detention of Tibetans for peaceful expression of political views and the suppression of Tibetan religious expression, as well as what are described as excessive security measures. We have raised some of these. We have raised our concerns with counterparts, and I would say for the first time, an Australian government. This is the first time Australian government has done this. Australia raised our concerns in our national statement at the Human Rights Council in March, and I again say that is the first time an Australian government has done that, and in part I would credit not just the parliamentary friends but also members of the community for their advocacy.
Thanks, President. Thank you, Foreign Minister. I'd like to know whether you have received anything of any substance from the Chinese government regarding the repression of human rights, freedom in Tibet and the Sinicisation of Tibetan culture. And I'd also draw your attention back to the key issue in my first question, which was about the Dalai Lama and what, if anything, you have received from the Chinese government in terms of their involvement in the selection of the next Dalai Lama.
As Senator Rice would be aware, I've spoken in this chamber and publicly about the importance of dialogue and engagement with China, but I've also spoken about the challenges of navigating that relationship. We are obviously there are differences which have to be managed, and those differences include a difference of views about political systems. But what I would say, so that the term of the question appears to suggest that these are matters we can obtain an outcome within China about. What we can do is to advocate, and we are seeking to do that both bilaterally and through multilateral processes. And I think that advocacy matters in the international community. But obviously, I appreciate that others would like to.
Has expired.
Thanks, President. Minister, 6 UN Special Rapporteurs have written to the Chinese government about forced labour in Tibet, raising concerns about the extensive labour transfer program in the Tibetan Autonomous Region, placing rural workers into low-skilled and low-paid industrial jobs, and allegedly eroding Tibetan minority languages, cultural practices and religion. Will the government implement a ban on the import of goods produced by forced labour, as agreed to in the ALP National Conference platform, given that the Labor had voted in support of this ban whilst in opposition?
Thank you, Senator Cash. Minister Wong. I beg your pardon, Senator Rice.
Thank you, Senator Rice. So, prior to the election, we announced a strengthening of the modern slavery framework. I was part of the discussion about that after engaging with civil society advocates, including Walk Free. And the approach we are taking is to work to strengthen our domestic framework so that we can ensure, as far as we are able, that Australian consumers can have confidence in the supply chains of products that they buy, goods and services that they purchase, from whichever jurisdiction. I don't think there's anyone in Australia who would advocate or believe that it is acceptable for us to, or for companies to profit from forced labour. So the approach we are taking is the Modern Slavery Act. The Attorney-General is leading that. A review has been conducted and government will formulate its response in relation to that review.
My question today to the Foreign Minister went to the heart of what Australia could do to apply pressure to the Chinese government to end the appalling abuses of human rights in Tibet, a country that was occupied by the Chinese forces 64 years ago, where Tibetan people have had their culture and their religious rights and freedom of speech and freedom of movement obliterated. I mean, I'm pleased the Foreign Minister told us that she met with the delegations of Tibetans who are raising the appalling situation in Tibet with parliamentarians today. Good on them. But I was incredibly disappointed with the limp response I got today, asking what was the Foreign Minister doing, what was the Australian government doing about the appalling oppression of Tibetans, including in applying pressure to the Chinese government so that the Chinese government doesn't interfere in the selection of the next Dalai Lama. Has the Foreign Minister even raised this issue with her counterpart? She refused to answer. I mean, we know that the Chinese government has got form in this regard. They kidnapped the Panchen Lama at the age of 6, 27 years ago, and he hasn't been seen from since. And as for the other questions they asked about the oppression of human rights, sinicising of Tibetan culture, the use of forced labour, taking of children away from their families and being educated in Chinese boarding schools, some only returning to their families once a year and losing their language and culture, all the Foreign Minister could tell me was that she had raised these issues, that we had raised these issues, that essentially if they don't listen, oh well, what more can we do? There is so much more that we can do. We could ban the import of goods produced with forced labour, as per the Labor Party's National Conference platform. We could instigate Magnitsky sanctions on Chinese government officials who are responsible for human rights violations. And we know from a recent survey that 2/3 of Australians have said that human rights accountability was more important than a resumption of trade with China. Despite the merciless, countless attacks on the Tibetan people, however, I am constantly in awe of the warmth and resilience of the Tibetan people and community. So to all the people of Tibet, please know that we hear you and that your voices matter, not just on Tibetan Lobby Day today, but every day. And us Greens will continue to amplify your voices inside and outside the Parliament.